record. I hope everyone is well and in good spirits. And thank you all for taking the time to stop by. My name is Kyle Tribble, and I serve as the Director of Culture and Engagement here at the District's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I want to welcome you all to the Equity in Practice series. I would also like to acknowledge and take time to acknowledge that May is Jewish American Heritage Month. In this month, we want to highlight and recognize the work and history of the Jewish community. We are very excited that our partner here at the ADL is helping us do just that in this session. So we're very excited. Many of you have been here before, but I know I see a few new faces for the first time. So I'll be giving just a little bit more context about equity in practice, but I also will go into just a few quick housekeeping rules. So for attendees, we're asking all attendees to remain on mute during the session until the Q&A session, which will happen immediately after today's presentation. So then you'll have a lot of time to ask a few questions. I also want to make mention that this session will be recorded. That's also indicated in your top left corner. So this session is being recorded. So as for the Equity in Practice series, Equity in Practice is a collection of community learning opportunities hosted by the School District of Philadelphia's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Equity Coalition in collaboration with community-based organizations that are focused on equity, cultural awareness, and social justice. So in this series, community-based organizations will highlight their organization services, resources, their connection to equity, and also leave the school district community with best practices that promote equitable change and equitable action. The goal of this series is to establish a community of learning between the SDP community and community-based organizations that will promote a collective of learning and collective action that leads to equitable change throughout the city of Philadelphia. And as always, we want to start with those historically marginalized communities and populations. So in today's session, we're excited to welcome Senior Associate Regional Director of Education at the Anti-Defamation League, ADL Philadelphia, Randi Boyette. So thank you so much for joining us, Randi. The ADL is a global leader in combating anti-Semitism, countering extremism, and battling bigotry wherever and whenever it happens. The ADL works to protect democracy and also to ensure a just and inclusive society for all. In today's session, Randi is gracious enough to outline the ADL's organization connection to social justice, but also discuss ways to challenge anti-Semitism and bigotry towards members of other marginalized communities as well, and also provide best practices on how to support Jewish students and colleagues within the school district community. So thank you for being here, Randi, and I'll pass it off to you.
Okay, thank you. So nice to be with you all. I will share my screen for a minute. And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about anti-Semitism. I will introduce you to Leon Bass in a moment because I'd like to show you a brief video that he created. I knew him. He was a former Philadelphia school district principal. He was at Ben Franklin High School for many years and a really, really lovely guy. But before I introduce you to Leon, I just want to supplement what Kyle said about ADL. We've been around since 1913. I think what's really cool about our mission is that it was a dual mission from the start. A group of white Jewish guys in Chicago understood that in 1913, our country, while it was a great place, was not always an easy place for folks in marginalized communities. And the folks at the ADL decided that in their mission statement, they were going to talk about, yes, dealing with anti-Semitism, but also working towards securing justice and fair treatment for everybody. And our goal is really lofty, a world in which no group or individual suffers from bias, discrimination, or hate. And we do this work all the time, every day. And we have for well over 100 years. So I just want to also tell you ADL's perspective on hate. We believe all forms of hate are equally serious and damaging. We think that hate escalates when it's unchecked. We also believe that hate incidents do have an enhanced impact because their message incidents, it's not just directed at one person, it's directed at an entire group and require an enhanced response. But we also believe that hate speech, because it is protected speech, is best combated by anti-hate speech. We also think about the escalation of hate, and it's a little like, you know, the frog that's taken a very nice bath in some water and it just gets hotter and hotter. And while he's busy in that bathtub, he's not realizing that it's become really, really dangerous. So we see it in sort of this triangle, and the base of the triangle is attitudes, negative biased attitudes, which then lead to acts of bias. Systemic discrimination gets baked into this. Bias motivated violence can be part of this dynamic. And then when it gets really, really extreme, we get into this situation of genocide sometimes. So I want to stop sharing this screen, and I want to go to a different screen, and I want to introduce you to Leon, because Leon is included in one of the resources that we use to teach about Holocaust and genocide. Leon Bass was he's an African-American. Well, now he's gone. He died a number of years back, but he understood racism and anti-Semitism because of his personal experience as a Black person in this country and in our communities, but then also as a United States soldier during World War II, when he was involved in the liberation of the camps. And he saw a different kind of racism that he then went on to speak about, the both kinds of racism that he saw when what he experienced personally and what he saw in the aftermath of World War II. So let me share my screen and introduce you to Leon in it's like a 2-minute clip that we use in our Holocaust education programming. So let me bring up Leon.
Evil is still with us. We have just to look at the news, television, papers. So you see the evil is still with us. I'm talking about racism, anti-Semitism, talking about bigotry and prejudice, talking about all that hate and war. It's still with us. And it's up to us to deal with it. Young people ask me, what can you give me to fight the evil? I always tell them there's only 2 things that I can think of that support. One is your education. If you can't read, write, or do your computational skills, you're in trouble. You can become a victim, or you might make somebody else a victim in your ignorance. Then I say the other piece of the action is love. Love is pat them back and pat them here and so on, right, and letting people do what they want to do. No, love is when you challenge people, tell them they're wrong, even when they're your best friend. You tell them you're wrong. I love you. That's love.
That's Leon. He was a really spectacular person, and I imagine he was a great principal, though I knew him in his retirement days. So I want you to think about what you've seen and experienced. And there's some folks that are on the screen, but who here can think of a common stereotype about an identity group that you belong to? Just by a show of hands. We're not going to ask you to list them, right? Stereotyping is like baked in. Who here knows at least one stereotype about Jewish people? Who here's heard a joke about Jewish people? A joke about the Holocaust? We've seen stuff and we know it exists. Let me go back to the slide. Let me go back to the slide deck. Y'all see that? All right, before we talk about what anti-Semitism is, I want to talk about what it actually means to be Jewish, because we're such a small minority that not everybody really understands even what it means to be Jewish. So so people are like, is it a religion? Is it a race? Is it an ethnicity? Like, what does it mean to be Jewish? So Judaism is the oldest surviving monotheistic religion. Many Jewish people aren't religious at all. There are Jews that are atheists or agnostics. Jews are multi-ethnic. Jews are not a racial group, but they're perceived to be a racial group by racists. 12 to 15% of Jews in the United States are Jews of color. In Israel, only 30% of the Jews are actually descendants of white European Jews. Only 30%. But when we think about our perception of Jews, it's often that Jews are white, which is actually very painful for the Jews of color that I know personally. And I've heard that this is, a widespread source of pain for Jews of color. So what does it actually mean to be Jewish? And being Jewish can be about all of these things on this list, one of them, two of them, but it's not just a religion, and it's not just an ethnicity, because Jews are multi-ethnic. So it can be any of this. But what it does mean that being Jewish, if you are Jewish, you are a part of a tiny minority. 0.2% of the population of the world. So if there's 15 million Jews in the world out of 8 billion people, there's 500 people in a room, only one person would be Jewish. That seems really crazy, but I was actually at a Catholic school doing this. I was the only Jewish person in a room full of, in fact, 500 people. It was such an interesting visual for me. In the United States, there's about 7.5 million Jews, so about half the Jews in the world live here in the United States, and here we're about 2.4% of the population. Still a very tiny number. So let's talk a little bit about the Jewish connection to the land of Israel with some perspective in history. So Jews are connected to the land of Israel through history, through theology, and through culture. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all text-based faith traditions. So I'm sure that for many of us, this is sort of knowledge we know. The land is gifted to Abraham, the forefather of the Jewish people, but also connected to other faith traditions. And he settled at God's command in the land of Israel. The Bible tells the story of the famine that sent the descendants of Abraham to Egypt, the enslavement and the freeing from enslavement in Egypt, the wandering around in the desert, and then the return to the land of Israel. That story is a foundational story for the Jewish people, one that 70% of American Jews, so that's even the Jews that are not particularly religious, 70% of American Jews recount that story each year during the holiday of Passover. So it's an important story for the Jewish people. The tribes of Israel, who were the descendants of the sons of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, they formed the kingdom of Israel, and the Jewish people develop as a civilization in the land of Israel. They're exiled from the land, first by the Babylonians, then by the Romans, who destroyed first one temple, then the second temple. But there was always a remnant of Jews remaining in that land. The exiled Jews never forgot Jerusalem and their homeland. And to this day, when Jewish people pray, they pray facing Jerusalem. Although Jews prayed to return to the land of Israel, it was more future-oriented than reality-based, as Jews were very happy to be living where they were, and most Jews still are, right? European anti-Semitism, long before the rise of Nazism, was actually one of the main reasons that European Jews began to yearn for a state of their own, a place where they could actually feel safe. So the Holocaust was the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million plus Jews. Researchers are looking at this, and one researcher I know thinks the number is going to rise by millions by the time they get all the counting done. But 6 million plus. That's what this was. So many of you probably know that as Nazi tyranny spread, the Nazis and their helpers persecuted and murdered millions of other people as well. Political dissidents, communists, German citizens with mental or physical disabilities, Roma and Sinti people, all this whole list. But anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, was at the heart of Nazi ideology. So in 1933, when the Nazis came to power, there were over 9 million Jews in Europe living in Germany and also the other countries that Germany would come to occupy and influence. Jewish people did try to leave Europe. And in fact, Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, in the 30s, early in the 30s, took his family out of Germany because he saw what was going on. The Nazis were happy to let people leave. The problem was there were very few countries, including the United States, that were actually willing to take in many Jewish refugees. This is the result. By 1945, the Nazis and their collaborators killed nearly 2 out of every 3 European Jews. A third of the total population of Jews in the world were killed in that very tight time frame. So when we think about these numbers, they're so huge. I like to always remind myself that behind every number, there are faces, there are people, and there are ashes in these places where people were. Even after the Holocaust, nations were still unwilling to open their doors to those Jews who had actually survived. The DP camps didn't close until the 50s. In 1948, the UN voted to create 2 independent states, as you see from the slides, one for Jewish people, one for the Arabs. The Jewish people were not happy about this deal. The deal didn't include Jerusalem, where all their sort of religious yearning had been for centuries. But they took the deal because they were coming out of a situation where 6 million plus of their people had actually been murdered. Arab leadership, they were in a different place. They rejected the deal. And tragically, the conflict in that land continues to this day. Many Holocaust survivors 100% believe that had there been a Jewish state in the 30s, there would have been a place to escape to. A country that would have let them in. As we talk about all of this, I want to just make the point that, like all of the isms, the hate that's directed toward a group of people does not define them. We are not defined by anti-Semitism. People of color are not defined by racism. LGBTQIA plus community members are not defined by the hate that's directed at them. It's something we live with and we deal with. What I would like to do now is share a brief video that we created along with Hillel, which is an organization that, that works with Jewish students on college campuses. And this will walk us through the history of anti-Semitism in under 10 minutes. So let me stop sharing this and pull up that video. It will define anti-Semitism and it will walk us through it really quickly. So let me pull that up. You all see this or hear it?
Some say anti-Semitism is one of the oldest hatreds, but what is it really? Anti-Semitism is prejudice, discrimination, or oppression directed toward Jews as individuals or as a group.
You can't see it. Thank you for letting me know.
Well, the term anti-Semitism didn't exist until the late 1800s.
Hang on one second.
Hatred of the Jewish people has existed for millennia and has persisted throughout the world. Anti-Semitism has endured because it adapts to social, political, and religious contexts.
We get, oh, I can see it, but you just took it off.
You can't see it. Okay, let me put it
But
back
you just
up.
took it off. Yeah, put it back on.
In nearly every historical era,
Can you
the
see it
Jewish
now?
Anti-Semitic imagination
Yes.
has
Thank you,
represented the
Antoinette.
collective
You're
fear,
welcome.
prejudices of various groups and societies. By blaming Jews, those with power or those who seek it can distract attention away from the actual sources of the problems they're responding to.
What we call anti-Semitism today began in the ancient Roman and Greek empires with hostility towards Jews and Judaism. Such attitudes continued among many early Christians. As Christianity grew and Jews did not embrace their theology, many Christians portrayed Jews as a constant threat. In the Middle Ages, Christian crusaders led massacres of Jews in many cities. Throughout Europe, Jews were expelled from hundreds of towns and villages and falsely accused of poisoning wells and even causing plagues.
In 1492, during the Spanish Inquisition, Jews were killed, forcibly converted to Catholicism, or expelled from Spain. In 1543, Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant movement, wrote that the Jews are a base, foreign people, that is, no people of God. Two key anti-Semitic myths became pervasive in Christianity of the Middle Ages. First, deicide. The Catholic Church falsely accused Jews of having murdered Jesus Christ. This accusation has fueled anti-Semitism for centuries.
Second, the blood libel. False claim that Jews murder Christian children and use their blood for ritual purposes, like baking matzah for Passover. The blood libel spread throughout the world and over time, resulting in violence and murder of Jews from Europe to North Africa, and persists even today. In the Middle East and North Africa, Jews were considered dhimmi under Muslim law. This meant that they had protected status as people of the book. Like Christians, Jews were permitted to maintain and practice their religion, but they were also seen as inferior to Muslims and had to pay a special tax.
Jews often were required to wear distinguishing articles of clothing identifying themselves as Jews, or to ride donkeys rather than horses so they were not as high as Muslims. Sometimes, when criticizing dhimmi religions, Jews were depicted as apes and Christians as pigs. Sometimes, Jews were accused of stepping beyond the dhimmi's proper social status, and those accusations sometimes led to restrictions on Jewish worship, violence against Jews, or forced conversion to Islam.
During the Middle Ages, decrees ordering the destruction of synagogues were enacted in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and massacres of Jews occurred in Morocco. In Damascus in 1840, Jews were falsely accused of ritual murder, leading to the imprisonment and torture of Jewish leaders. In the 1800s, Jews in the Russian Empire were subjected to repressive, discriminatory laws and were forced to live in restricted geographic areas, where they were frequently victims of violent pogroms. Under Soviet rule, the Hebrew language was banned. Jewish religious practices were criminalized, and cultural institutions shuttered.
In the late 1800s, the pseudoscience of eugenics emerged, which erroneously categorized groups of people biologically based on alleged physical traits. These developments catalyzed the rise of racial ideologies that led to deep-seated prejudices and, ultimately, lethal persecution of specific groups. Now, anti-Semitism, previously understood as a religious hatred, became linked to the new race categories. This had enormous consequences because it meant that Jews could no longer escape persecution by converting to Christianity. Rather, their Jewishness and their difference was permanent.
German writer Wilhelm Marr popularized the word anti-Semitism in 1879 because he was looking for a scientific-sounding term to replace the word Judenhass, Jew hatred. The root word Semite had been used to refer to people with origins in the Middle East, including Jews and Arabs, giving the false impression that anti-Semitism is directed against all Semitic people. But anti-Semitism has long been explicitly the specific hatred of Jews. Marr used the term to push a racialized idea that the solution to all of society's problems was to radically reduce Jews' corrosive influence.
In the late 19th and early 20th century, European powers colonized significant portions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, whom they frequently labeled racially inferior. At the same time, they persecuted Jews inside of Europe. When the openly anti-Semitic Nazi Party took power in Germany in 1933, widespread ideas about Jewish people as members of a foreign, threatening race took on lethal violence of an unprecedented level. From 1933 to 1945, in the Holocaust, Nazi Germany murdered approximately 6 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of members of other targeted minority groups.
After the Holocaust, anti-Semitism didn't go away. A remarkably consistent set of myths and tropes emerged repeatedly and continue to this day. These include 1. Financial exploitation and greed. Early Christians banned Jews from most professions, relegating them to jobs of tax collector, rent collector, and moneylenders, leading to widespread notions of Jewish financial exploitation and greed. 2. Power and control. The idea that Jews control banks, governments, foreign policy, the media, social movements. Conspiracy theories about Jews' power to cause plagues spread anti-Semitism in medieval times with the Black Death and modern times with COVID-19. 3. Disloyalty and dishonesty. Suspecting Jews of holding allegiance only to fellow Jews and a Jewish agenda. Seeing Jewish people as dishonest and untrustworthy neighbors and citizens who are inherently disloyal or have dual loyalties.
Anti-Semitism can seem paradoxical because Jews are all things to anti-Semites. Jews are, for instance, represented frequently as both evil capitalists and subversive socialists. Jews are perceived by some as pacifists and simultaneously by others as too militaristic. Anti-Semitism can be conscious through verbal stereotypes, hateful flyers, or negative references to Jews in casual conversation or in the classroom. Anti-Semitism can be unconscious in the form of microaggressions.
You're Jewish? Wow, you don't look Jewish.
Or making assumptions about values or beliefs.
It can even be disguised as compliments, such as talking about Jews being the only trustworthy bankers, or the best spouse, or that you should only hire a Jewish lawyer. And in popular culture, during the time of Shakespeare or today, we see the phenomenon called villain coding, where characters are clearly based on anti-Semitic stereotypes.
Anti-Semitism leads to a climate of fear and intimidation, attacks on Jewish individuals, and the murder of Jews as they are deemed to be a perpetual other, either because of their religion or the stereotypes created by the racialization of Jew hatred. Anti-Semitism is a warning for all societies. It often helps fuel increasing authoritarianism, the erosion of democratic norms, and other systemic oppressions and bigotries.
Anti-Semitism is not just hateful and wrong towards Jews. It gives license and societal consent to hate that targets other specific groups of people. That is something we all need to work against and eradicate from our communities.
Okay. Let me get back to the slide deck. All right, so let's talk about where we are today. I do want to just say that video is pretty painful, and the point of it is not about shame and blame. It's about bravely facing challenging history in order to do better and be better. And I, as an American, I think we need to face our own very challenging American history, particularly around race. And it isn't always easy, but I think that it's critically important to do that work without feeling shame and blame, and just, it is what it is, right? And there's a story behind each of the isms that I think that we need to look at bravely in order to do better. So ADL has been tracking anti-Semitic incidents since 1979. So 2022, as you see from the slide, 2022 showed a 36% increase over 2021. And look at 2021 over 2013. I've been at ADL since 2003. And the numbers back then were closer to the 13, 14 mark. And you see this jump in 2017. And it just kept getting higher. But to have an increase like this seems particularly alarming. And it's being felt by Jewish people. So you see, we're in one of those dark blue states where there's 100+ incidents. So this is just, where all this stuff is going on. And I wanted to give you the data for the schools, because in 2022, there were 494 anti-Semitic incidents in non-Jewish, specifically non-Jewish K through 12 schools. This is a 49% increase over 2021, a 49% increase in 1 year. And you see the difference between 2020. We look at the anti-Semitic incidents on college and university campuses, also another big increase that we're seeing. So harassment, that would be, that's sort of like some examples of harassment. What a student would say to another student, "Oh, Jew, why don't you kill yourself?" Or a student shouting in the middle of a math class, "If anyone celebrates Yom Kippur today, you can just die." So with the vandalism included in schools, we're talking K through 12 schools, included messages such as "Kill all Jews," "Hitler was right," "Jews not welcome." And here's what we know about kids reporting this stuff. We know that this is underreported. Kids usually do not tell what's going on in their schools. So we're concerned about that. In early October 2022, Kanye West said some very, very challenging things in social media posts and interviews. He brought out longstanding anti-Semitic tropes, like you saw, including claims about supposed Jewish power and control and all of this. He also praised Hitler, and he disputed the facts of the Holocaust. So this is one person talking. That said, he's very influential because his comments were felt on the ground across the country. Our phone here in Philadelphia rang off the hook with stories from from schools, primarily middle schools. 59 incidents from October through the end of 22 were directly reported to ADL, which means that there were many, many more. People were actually assaulted in New York in December. Somebody hit a guy who looked recognizably Jewish and yelled "Kanye 2024. So we were seeing all of this. Words have a lot of power, and words of influential people wind up having a lot of power. So here's some anti-Semitic incidents from 2022. Middle school, this is from Philly. A middle school student drew a swastika, wrote "Heil Hitler" on it, put it on a Jewish classmate's desk. I thought the one from York, Pennsylvania was particularly interested. It was a bomb threat to JCC as a Jewish community center. "My goal is to kill as many Jewish babies and children as I can." They're walking cockroaches and vermin. This is right out of the Nazi playbook. So the past is always present. These are some of the common actions and trends that we see over time, like swastika after swastika after swastika, all of these things we see. And as you looked at that graph, you know that most of it was not violent, but there were violent events where anti-Semitism has shown up. Clearly, the shooting in Pittsburgh, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, which was supposed to be about Confederate flags and statues. And they were saying the Jews will not replace us. The Jews will not replace us. So what these folks are talking about is the idea, it's called the Great Replacement Theory, and it's the idea that Jews are masquerading as white to bring down white people. So to folks like these people in Charlottesville and extremists and hate groups, they believe that being Jewish is a race and not a white race. There were other violent events in Poway in California, Jersey City. On January 6th, the guy in the sweatshirt is from the January 6th attack on the Capitol. He's wearing a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt. There's another one that said 6MWE, which means 6 million wasn't enough. And then in Colleyville on Saturday, January 15th in 2022, a gunman entered a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. He believed the trope about Jewish power. He wanted Jewish people to make the phone call that was going to get a particular prisoner released. They did not have the power to do it, and luckily, but sadly, he died. That person died because he believed in an anti-Semitic trope and took a group of people hostage. So this flyer is from a university here in Philadelphia. This is actually, even though we're seeing this enormous rise, this was from a few years back. There's so much anti-Semitism online that when we're asking students if they've seen this, everybody's seen it. Like everybody has seen anti-Semitic stuff online. Anti-Semitism is not just growing here in the United States, it's growing around the world. It is illegal in Germany. Illegal, they will throw you in jail to put swastikas on things in Germany in a post-World War II time. And we see it in Germany all the time. We also want to survey Americans about attitudes and beliefs, because it's from there that we see the incidents. So 20% believe in 6 or more anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. 20% say that Jews have too much power in the United States. You can see the rest of these. And this is the impact. 75% of Jews in the United States say that there's more anti-Semitism today than 5 years ago. That was not the case when I came to ADL 19 years ago. This one, the second one, really stood out for me because Jewish people ages 18 to 29, these are not folks that generally feel nervous about anti-Semitism, right? But almost half of the Jews in the United States in this particular poll, and it was a statistically sound poll, they feel less safe than they did 5 years ago. I've been at ADL for 19 and a half years. It's only in this last year or two that I've actually heard Jewish people say that they do not like to tell people their last names if their last names are recognizably Jewish. I never heard that before. And at the same time, Jewish people are feeling this impact of rising anti-Semitism, and they're getting nervous, and it's really affecting them. Half of all Americans have still never heard about anti-Semitism. They don't know what it means. They're like, what? Isn't it like a bunch of white people? Like they don't understand it at the same time that Jewish people are getting more and more frightened. So let's talk a little bit about Israel, because it comes up some. I think anti-Semitism on the extreme right, we've seen it's much more linked to violence, but criticism of Israel is a thing. And I think we just need to put it out there. So all criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Want to criticize the government, the policies, the politicians? Absolutely. That's what Israelis do. Jewish Israelis do that all the time. It's just like being an American. We constantly criticize our government, our institutions. It doesn't mean we're un-American. It means we're fully American. However, if you direct the criticism against all citizens, let's say, versus the government, or if you say that Israel's right to exist is called into question, but other nations, their right to exist isn't, if the only country you have a problem with is Israel and all other countries are getting a pass, then it's something to think about. It's something to think about. And this is what it looks like. This was at an anti-Israel rally. This guy's headband didn't say kill Israelis. It didn't say kill the head of the government at the time. It said kill Jews. This feeling about Israel, when it morphs into attitudes about Jews, there's a line that gets crossed. And it gets crossed sometimes, not always, but it does. And Jewish kids on college campuses sometimes feel the sting of this. So why should we care and what can we do? I spend more of my time at ADL dealing with all of the other isms than I ever do with anti-Semitism. I do a lot of work in schools, and when we're working in schools, and I work, I do work with the school district and in multiple school districts in the tri-state area, we're mostly dealing with racism and anti-LGBTQIA+ bias, with some classism and appearance bias baked in there too. But why should we care about anti-Semitism too? So Deborah Lipstadt says that no healthy democracy can afford to tolerate it. Martin Luther King Jr. early took a stand against anti-Semitism, as he said, because it's wrong, it's unjust, and it's evil. Martin Luther King Jr. came to his attitudes about anti-Semitism because he knew Jewish people. And he cared about them. I know a Holocaust survivor that had dinner with him here in Philadelphia, and he was telling the people at the dinner table, Judy can't eat that. That's not kosher. Like, Martin Luther King Jr. was connected to the Jewish community. And it was because of that connection that he challenged anti-Semitism where he saw it. It's those connections and thinking about being for each other and getting to know people that can make a difference as we challenge all of the isms, because it really does begin with us. We need to challenge our own implicit and explicit biases. And that's about all groups. And that's where ADL is. Yeah, we're talking about anti-Semitism today, but we could easily be talking about racism or anti-LGBTQIA+ expressions or any of the other isms and bigotries we have. So what do? We need to identify experiences and messages that we've had about other folks. If we get to know people that belong to other identity groups, it interferes with the stereotyping process. And if we actively refrain from judging other folks based on aspects of their identity, we can make a difference. So let me check on time. Okay, so I will open it up to any questions, concerns, or pushback that anybody may have.